I've teamed up with Emma Bed, who I've worked with before because I love them and every single bed in our house is an Emma bed with Emma mattress. But now, because I have quite a busy household, and particularly at Christmas, the holiday season for us is about a packed house, I've decided it's time for an incredible sofa bed. Emma does the most incredible sofa bed. Honestly, if you want something that looks really cool, sleek, is used as a piece of furniture on a day-to-day basis, but also converts into a super, super comfortable bed, then this is 100% for you. Also, if I'm going to be honest, Pete does snore, so it is kind of really convenient having a spare bed that, should he need to, shall we say, be evicted from our bed space on certain nights because the snoring is so intolerable, he has a comfortable space and place to go. If you want to find out more about Emma Bed products, there are so many to choose from. They bring a massive amount of comfort to your life. And what's amazing right now is that you get up to 55% off. And guess what? You even get an extra discount on top of that using the code EmmaKennyBD. So what are you waiting for? Increase your comfort, get a better night's sleep, and I don't know, look at potentially giving yourself the extra space that's required on occasions by investing in something like the Emma sofa bed. It's awesome. In the quiet, unassuming corners of Solon Township, Michigan, a story of unspeakable tragedy quietly unfolded, one that remains etched in the hearts of that community. Born into a world where she should have been cherished, Mary Ann Welch's life was cut tragically short by the very hands that were meant to hold and nurture her. When Mary took a final breath at 10 months old, she weighed a mere 8 pounds, her fragile existence ending in solitude in a crib meant for comfort, but turned into a silent witness to her neglect. This is the harrowing tale of Mary Ann Welch, a 10-month-old child whose life whispered a painful echo of neglect and abandonment. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I've wanted to do this case for a while. Quite a lot of you have asked me for it, but also I watched a great deal of the trial, and I've also watched all of the interrogations that are available and the interviews that were done. And to say I felt a level of rage was an understatement. When you watch cases unfold that involve the absolute degradation of a life and the abandonment of responsibility to such a degree that we're talking about the starving to death of a child, it is almost incomprehensible to compute when you consider that this happened in the Western world. We appreciate that in certain countries that are torn into by war and famine, that these things wrongly play out. But when people have the opportunity to provide a life for a child that is full of nutrition, they have the resources around them, and they choose not to, well, that speaks of the unspeakable with respect. Let's look at the antagonist, so to speak, in this case. So we've got Seth Welch. He's the father. He was a farmer in Kent County. He was married to a girl called Tatiana Fusari, and they were a couple who lived together in Kent County, Michigan. What is it about these two that really provokes me from the get-go? Well, first of all, they hadn't planned on having any children. And you know what, guys? That would have been the right decision. You know, ultimately, that instinct that you have that says to you, maybe we're not cut out to be parents, it's the correct one. It's rare. The vast majority of people feel quite at peace with the idea of having a family. But for these individuals, they should most definitely have gone with that initial belief that they weren't the right kind of people to bring children onto this earth. However, in spite of that, somehow they planned on having none, but ended up having 3 children together. And by the way, at the time of their arrest, they were pregnant with a 4th. How is it that people who genuinely do not deserve children at all somehow are blessed with one after the other. And also, what does that say to you about these two? They're 27 years of age when they are arrested for this particular crime. At that point, you would think that just understanding the mere basics of conception would enable you to prevent it. Simple as, just put something on it. That would be number one. Or go and speak to your healthcare provider. And I'm sure it's going to be clear as I talk through this case why that probably didn't happen. But nonetheless, it's a very simple equation when it comes to not having children. Just don't have sex or use protection. You literally learn that so early on that I can't remember a time of not knowing. Now, at the time of this tragedy, like I said, Seth and Tatiana, they're both 27 years of age. They've got a 4-year-old, they've got a 2-year-old, they've got a 10-month-old, and they're also pregnant with that 4th child. They all live on this farm together and essentially grow fruit and vegetables to sell. And even though that doesn't bring in a huge income, obviously, it means they've got fruit and vegetables, just throwing it out there. Because this story is going to be a tale where it is incomprehensible for me to say what I've just noted about what they were doing, and then to end up at the point that we're going to end up regarding what happens to the child. So on August the 2nd, 2018, 911 call is made. This is after Sean, the father, finds their 10-month-old daughter, Mary, unresponsive in her crib. Sean, when he's on the phone call, sounds like somebody who is literally talking about something of no meaning. There's no emotion. You just hear such shallow effect. And it's almost as if he's just talking through the events. And I would almost say, as he's describing it, it feels more of a frustration, annoyance, etc., than the grief-stricken sound that we would expect from a father who's just found their child unresponsive. But to add insult to injury, when he found the child unresponsive and dialed 911, well, there was an hour-and-a-half gap. So, you come across your child in the crib, unresponsive, clearly either at severe risk or already passed. What are you going to do? Well, personally, I would probably need somebody else to ring 911 for me, because I would be screaming hysterically and trying to resuscitate my child and pleading with God, probably offering to sell my soul to the devil equally to just make sure that my child lives. But where Sean was concerned, he was like, well, I could possibly do that, but instead, probably best to call my lawyer.
How long ago did you find this child?
It's about an hour and a half. I was waiting. I called my lawyer first thing to ask, what's the next thing I could do. And they said, wait till they're here to call, the police and get that going. Basically, it got to the point where I was waiting so long, I just kind of went ahead and did it anyway. And we're almost here. So I was waiting on legal counsel.
So you found the child an hour and a half ago?
Yeah.
And called your lawyer first, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any other children in the home right now?
Yeah. Because I didn't know if I was supposed to call the police or not. I had no idea what to do.
Okay. We will send someone out. We're going to investigate. When was the last time you had contact with a child?
Last night, yesterday afternoon, about 3 p.m. She goes to bed, and that was that.
Okay, so you put her to bed yesterday at 3 p.m.
Yeah, and then this morning at 10 something, we finally went in to check on her. Like, okay, it's been way too long, so It's becomes long all the time normally, so.
So you're saying it is normal for your children to sleep from around 3 p.m. till 10 a.m.?
Usually about 9:30, yeah. So.
They sleep from 3 p.m. to... I'm just typing in a couple things here.
Sure.
What time do they usually have dinner?
Oh, well, this is my infant. They're not all, they don't all kind of run on the schedule, but she basically eats and She's up for a half hour after that, and then she goes down for bed.
Okay. And how old are the other children?
4 and 2.
And there's 2 other children?
Yep.
And they're at home right now, right?
Yep.
And you said when you found her, she was already believed to be deceased, right?
Yes.
And that's when you consulted with a lawyer?
Yep.
And do you believe she was beyond help already?
Oh, yeah, she was dead as a doormat.
I mean, don't know about you guys, but on the list of what you do when you find a child either nearly dead or indeed dead, the most obvious thing to do is to just think, I'll call my legal team. I mean, it seems like such a normal emotional reaction. Goes straight down with that grief, doesn't it? You know, I'm absolutely brokenhearted, so I best just call my lawyer because I've done nothing wrong, so why would I need a lawyer? But I'll just call them anyway. That's how confused I am in this state because I'm so grief-stricken. I'm actually calling my lawyer instead of 911. Obviously, immediately that introduces us to somebody who recognises there is a level of culpability about their actions. So why does he wait 1.5 hours? That is absolutely harrowing because let's just put it into the context that this child is gravely ill, but that there is some potential hope if 911 operators are called and emergency services are sent and the responders are able to manage that situation. You are giving that child a chance. But if you find them gravely ill or unresponsive full stop, then by not calling them, you are essentially sealing their fate either way. But Sean just goes on to tell the operators that he did this because he was waiting on legal counsel to arrive before actually calling them. But because it had taken so long for the legal counsel to arrive, he decided that he'd best call them anyway, but 1.5 hours late. He then goes on to talk about the fact that he'd seen Mary, his daughter, at 3 p.m. the previous day, and he'd only just checked on her at 10 a.m. the next morning. So he'd obviously been a very capable parent. He'd checked on them twice in almost 24 hours. I mean, that just seems like totally normal parenting. What's really concerning is, put yourself in this position. Your child's unresponsive. You've already waited 1.5 hours before calling emergency responders, so you're looking guilty as hell. And then when you ask the question about when you might have seen them last, if you're going to try to create a fabrication that makes you look like a caring parent, you're going to talk about how often you check on a 10-month-old because it should be constant. I mean, at the end of the day, it should be a consistent theme in your parenting reality to be checking on your child consistently. But no, he says that he checked on Mary at 3 p.m. the previous day and then followed up with a next check at 10 a.m. the next morning, which is an absolutely enormous amount of hours to pass for a child to be by themselves, particularly if that child is quiet. And that speaks volumes because if that's him trying to cover his tracks, well, it's just opening the volume of neglect that is clearly happening because he's trying to defend himself with those words, as opposed to saying, well, I checked on her every few hours and she was fine. He's literally opening up the reality of I am a neglectful parent in that statement. He also describes Mary, this beautiful 10-month-old little girl, as dead as a doornail. Dead as a doornail. I feel a mix of anger and disgust and genuine rage when I think about this father, and I'll use that term very loosely when I'm describing this absolute dead weight of a human being, this flappy appendage of the largest and highest order, because he really doesn't deserve to be put in a category as a father. But to use the words to describe your deceased child as dead as a doornail has antisocial personality written all over it. It really does. The disassociation level there is absolutely enormous. It's beyond belief. Now, Seth had been the person who was responsible for Mary on the 1st of August, the day before her death, so it's in line with the fact that he checked her at some point during that day. And Tatiana had actually been at work. She'd been at McDonald's in Cedar Springs in the afternoon, but she'd also returned late in the evening. Now, Seth had said that Mary had been asleep. Of course she had. That's the obvious go-to. She'd been asleep throughout this time, and he didn't think to check. So it was only when he went in to check on her at 10 a.m. in the morning, which is way too long for a 10-month-old to be sleeping when you've only seen them at 3 p.m. the day before. And at this point, he realizes that she's unresponsive. So we are just introduced immediately to this lackluster, completely disconnected parent who can describe the passing of his gorgeous little girl, a child that so many of us would welcome into our home without a second's thought, with such coldness. Now, the fact that Seth had waited an hour and a half to call 911, the fact that he'd first called his lawyers and already had legal counsel prior to the incident, and that he sounded extremely cold and very nonchalant on the 911 call, it's going to alert the police. In fact, I imagine they have already made their minds up immediately. So when the investigators arrive, when they enter the home, a deputy actually recalled that Mary's eyes and cheeks were sunken into her head. And they also went on to state that she hadn't been breathing, that she was cold to the touch. So clearly there's a period of time that has passed between her being alive and dead for their discovery because she's cold. And when the detectives are talking about this in the interrogation, they are clearly very moved by what they've seen. It's been very traumatic. And they said that seeing Mary put tears in their eyes, they said it was the worst case of malnourishment that they'd ever seen in their careers. A paramedic who came to the scene, they were completely confused because they're listening to the information and trying to garner what's actually played out and what the patient has dealt with. And they can't work out in that moment whether they're dealing with a 10-day-old or a 10-month-old. Now, this is a paramedic who would regularly be seeing babies of 10 days old and babies of 10 months old. And the very fact that they're confused when they first find that little girl's body as to what age she is demonstrates just how malnourished she was. Now, the detectives immediately take Seth and Tatiana in for questioning. And I would say that they decided to use different techniques when it came down to interviewing them. So for Tatiana, the detectives, they tried to build up a lot of rapport. They used a very emotional approach. They wanted to get her to open up. It was a more nurturing, understanding, stroke manipulative type of interview. Whereas Seth, they basically left him alone in an interrogation room for about an hour and a half to kind of make the pressure build up within him. And essentially, I think they did that for good reason, because I think Tatiana is somebody who is quite easy to coerce, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean it in a good way, into opening up because there is some emotional cogency within her. Whereas Seth, when he was describing his daughter as dead as a doornail, he could literally have been describing his internal emotional self because there's just not a lot going on, really. Now, when Tatiana is interviewed, they basically get her to talk about her children because they want to understand what she is like as a parent in her perspective. And they do try to make her feel comfortable. They kind of laugh with her and engage with her. And I'm really disturbed about any mother who has just lost a baby and lost a baby in quite a torturous fashion, that she could even put a smile on her face. I don't think it's unusual for people to be totally numb and shut down when they're dealing with a horrific grief process, when they're dealing with the shock of that initial reality. But when somebody is able to engage and laugh on the day that she's literally lost something that should be considered incalculably important, a love of her life, that shows you that there again is not the connection that we would expect to know. She would seem at some points almost cheerful, particularly considering the circumstances that I'm describing. Now, Tatiana was very eloquent. She could offer detailed answers to the questions that were regarding Mary's case, and she was able to give details about Mary's development, about her weight, about her eating. And she said that at around 6 months, Mary weighed around 16 to 18 pounds, but at 10 months, at the time of her death, she actually only weighed about 8 pounds. So that's the weight of a newborn. So as far as her mother was concerned, at 6 months, Mary's at this 16 to 18 pound level. And if you think about a breastfeeding child, that could well be the case. But at 10 months, she's halved that weight. Yet Tatiana says that she believed that Mary was going to be about 20 pounds at the time of her death, which is ludicrous. Because like I said, she's absolutely emaciated. And if she's watched her gather weight, well, arguably, she's going to have seen her at 16 to 18 pounds and she's going to noted that the child has diminished. Otherwise, when she's saying that the child has increased in weight to get to 20 pounds, at 16 or 18 pounds, she'd have been unbelievably small and so on and so forth. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. But she's trying to put across that firstly, she's a loving parent. Secondly, that she's a devoted mother. And most importantly, that the child was healthy. And she actually describes Mary as petite, but said there was nothing concerning. She also noted that, yes, in the 3 days prior to Mary's death, she'd been sleeping a lot. She'd been eating well, though. So even though she had actually been sleeping a lot, they'd still been feeding her effectively, but that she had noted that she'd lost weight in the past 3 days. And the response to this, and of course, as a mother who's devoted to her child, as she sees this weight diminishing, she obviously goes and sees a healthcare provider to ask for advice, because that's what a loving parent, responsible parent does. But she didn't get the memo on that, actually. She's like, well, I could do that, but instead I'm just going to pray. Just gonna pray for Mary. Gonna pray. I mean, we've all seen it, haven't we? In massive famines, where just praying for children who are starving to death is such an effective remedy. Why worry about ending world poverty when we could just pray and food will be plentiful? Listen, I respect religions. Everyone who has a belief code and a belief system, it's important and valuable to those individuals. And people have different belief systems. I have a strong faith myself, but at no point have I ever considered the idea of praying when my child is very unwell. Unless I'm praying in tandem with getting the care that they need from the professionals who can give it. I'm not saying it isn't helpful to pray, both from a self perspective, where it actually makes you feel more positive, or indeed that there haven't been studies that show that praying for people can also aid healing in conjunction with other forms of healing. But the idea that she's watching this child diminish in weight, and if we were to listen to what she's saying, this child went from 20 pounds to 8 pounds in 3 days, you would be knocking on everyone's doors if you had any morals whatsoever. But this is the way that they've dealt with it. They're praying for Mary. And she described actually finding Mary unresponsive. She said that she attempted CPR. I would say that she's quite effective at answering the questions, but then you have to think about the fact she's had other children. She probably knows what a child should be developing like. She probably wants to act like she has a good grasp on parenting. So whilst on one level she might be thinking that this is defending her because she's coming out with the right answers, it's actually amplifying her guilt. Because if she knows what she should have been doing, why wasn't she doing it? And throughout the interrogation, she's smiling, she's pointing at things throughout it, but she's not actually meeting the detective's eyes during quite a lot of the questioning. And the detectives are quite tender with her, but they keep saying to her, listen, we know that something terrible has happened. We've never seen a child so malnourished. And she's genuinely feigning surprise. And she actually said that she was blinded to not see anything wrong with Mary. Now, contextually, if you were indeed literally physically blinded, one could say that you couldn't see what was wrong with Mary in a physical way because you don't have the power of sight. But you have hands. And in the interrogation, she definitely has hands. She was pointing with her fingers. So she isn't somebody who hasn't got the capacity to feel skin and bones. And whether she was blinded in her head in a way where she just didn't want to see bad things happening, well, that then defeats what she said about the reality of her praying for her daughter. If it got so bad that she's praying for her daughter to be healed, she's not blinded by it, is she? She knows what's going on. So as she starts to talk about more and more what's happened, and she is quite free with her speech, and that's often somewhere where you can trip yourself up, but she starts to say that it was Seth who didn't think that they needed to take Mary to a doctor. She said that she didn't want to believe that there was something wrong, but you don't get an option as a mother or a father to put the onus on another human being when it's your child. She had every opportunity to take her little girl to a doctor. The fact that she chose not to has got nothing to do with Seth and everything to do with her poor ability as a parent and her neglectful reality as a parent. And it's frustrating when somebody can literally allow their baby little girl to starve to death in front of their eyes and to just allay the responsibility to another party, in this case to Seth. I'm not saying that he is not guilty as hell, because he is, but it is astonishing to imagine that you can slowly allow your child to literally wither away in front of you and do nothing about it. Now, during the interview, it moves forward, and she then admits that around a month earlier, she had noticed that Mary's bones were showing. She said that she'd always been thin, but in the past month, she'd been extremely thin, but thought that she'd get better if she just kept feeding her. Now again, how ludicrous. So she was thin, but now she's extremely thin, to the point where her bones are sticking out, but maybe she'll just get better. Maybe you should just go and see a doctor. I mean, it's not the most complicated thing, is it? You just go and see a doctor, because your child is a priceless, valuable in your life. You'll do anything for them if you're a decent human being, but you didn't get the memo on that, did you? Either of you, when it comes down to Tatiana and Seth. Now, some children do fail to thrive. So around 45% of all deaths in young children are linked to malnutrition. And obviously, that's a lot to do with the fact that the world is very unfair, and there are some places in the world where children genuinely starve to death because there is no food available or very little food available. But in the Western world, it is rare. But when children suffer from acute malnutrition, one of the things that happens is their immune systems, they get so impaired that the risk of death is greatly increased, because you can get infections and they can't fight things off. And the critical age for malnutrition is from about 6 months. And the reason for this is when mothers generally start supplementing breast milk with other foods up until 24 months. So a lot of mums will still breastfeed, but also introduce solids, etc., to give them a full range of nutrition. So as far as I'm concerned, what's clearly changed is there's a strong likelihood that the baby's got to 6 months of age and she's stopped breastfeeding, or she's breastfed a lot less, and she hasn't been supplementing the baby with any other food. So the baby isn't getting enough food, full stop. And she also went on to admit that she didn't actually seek help because she was worried about the CPS calling. She thought that the doctors might say to the CPS that they needed to do a visit, and that made her feel that she didn't want to invite that back into her life because it had happened before, and she just decided that she'd hope that Mary would get better, because obviously we all know that hope is such an effective remedy. You know, whenever you've got a bill and you're struggling with money, you get the bill, you look at it and you just go, I hope that gets paid. And you do that 10 to 12 times, and the magic hope fairy comes and pays your water bill. It's an absolutely known, tried and tested tactic that's used the world over. Whenever my bills come, I just hope they'll be paid. It's all sorted. Honestly, life's never been better. But this is what she's saying. She hoped it'd get better. And the reason that she didn't want the CPS involved was because previously they'd been investigated for another incident. So CPS investigators had actually petitioned to remove their other child from the care of Seth and Tatiana in 2014. And this was because THC had been found in their eldest child's system at birth. But the reason that they wanted to remove the child is because they found essentially drugs in the system. You know, if you don't want CPS sniffing around, don't take a lot of drugs that then infect the system of your babies. It's a very simple recipe. Just be, I don't know, a responsible parent. She also went on to say, I didn't think at all that she would die, but then admits that this must have been a delusion. Yes, it was a delusion to anybody with eyes and hands, because clearly you could see and feel that this child was in absolute distress. She also said that she discussed Mary's condition with Seth around a month prior, which is when obviously she said she'd noticed that her little girl's getting thinner. And they had made a decision together where they were going to keep having faith and keep feeding her. I mean, again, I genuinely appreciate that people have different belief systems, but faith does not feed your child. And if the food that you are feeding your child is not giving them the nutrition they require and they're getting thinner, you need to add something else in there, don't you? You can't have blind faith. You have informed faith. Arguably, if God has presented us with the opportunities where we can seek help from people who can offer healing, then doing that would still be a godly thing to do, because people have been born with brains that have developed, that have created these opportunities where children in this situation, even when they have problems with metabolic disorders, can still be given the care by those who are educated and trained enough to do so. So it doesn't make sense that they're just saying no to something that could actually save their little girl. And she also went on to tell the investigators how often they'd had these conversations. Because obviously, if you've got a child who's seriously malnourished and is getting thinner by the day and you're worried about it, it's going to be a topic of conversation. So she admits to the police that they had talked about it twice. Twice. I've had more conversations about my microwave in the last month. It's amazing that she's bringing that in again, because that just amplifies her guilt. It amplifies the neglect. They've only spoken about this twice. So her interview has gone diabolically. And then Seth's interview, well, genuinely, I cannot imagine how the investigators felt when they were speaking to him. Because at least with Tatiana, there is some humanity there. She's useless and she's deserving of everything that comes for her. But there is some humanity there. Seth is devoid of it. He is so absolutely 100% egocentric. So at the point that he should be obviously grief-stricken, broken-hearted, his little girl's dead, he's made some horrible errors, clearly, in the fact that he literally spent an hour and a half not even calling emergency services. He should be very anxious, he should be fearful, he should be dealing with all of those very uncomfortable feelings as reality dawns. But instead he thinks it's a good time to share his beliefs in survival of the fittest. I kid you not. As if, well, at the end of the day, if they can't stand on their own 2 feet, you're not going to help them, because at the end of the day, they've got to be fit to survive. If they don't, it's on them. I mean, bearing in mind that if you were actually going to argue survival of the fittest, all babies would die. Because anybody who's ever held a newborn, as much as they are delightful, I know because I have one, the point is, if you put them on the floor and walked away, they wouldn't be wandering over and getting a can opener and preparing themselves beans on toast. You know, that's not what happens. They rely on adult nurturing humans to actually provide sustenance and care for them. But Seth obviously didn't get that memo. So he then goes on to talk about the fact that none of his kids had been vaccinated and that he believed that the weak should die and the strong should live. Now again, I have no issues with people choosing to vaccinate their kids or not choosing to vaccinate their kids. But that is not the argument that Seth is making. Seth is saying, we don't vaccinate the children because at the end of the day, if they get a case of measles and it's really bad and they die, well, that's the way it should have been. They were obviously weak. Makes no sense whatsoever. But that's his mindset. And this is during his interrogation, essentially. No, it's called an interview, but we know that at this point they suspect strongly that he is culpable. So this genuinely is an interrogation. But that is how he is framing it.
I'm not a big fan of a lot of the immunization stuff, and so I kind of balked against that, and they didn't like that either.
Also, he said that Mary's weight didn't concern him, and said that she was always smaller, she was born early, so makes her even more vulnerable, but hey, why worry about that? Said that she was never sickly, that she was never slow, she was never lethargic, she was just skinny. Can I just, sorry, Seth. So, can we just rewind? So she was never sickly. No, never sickly. She was never lethargic. No, never lethargic at all. Didn't you say that you saw her at 3 p.m. and then you didn't hear or see her till 10 a.m. the next day and you weren't concerned at all? I did say that. That's a long period of time for any baby to not actually make any noise or require feeding. That's because she wasn't sickly. She was really strong. She could just go for hours and hours and hours without any sustenance, care, attention, nutrition, or hydration. That's what I'm saying. She was just an incredibly strong, just slightly skinny child. I mean, talk about tripping yourself up. It's so easy to see through these kind of arrogant individuals' mindsets because they actually believe that the way that they live their life is so correct that they cannot deviate from that reality. And then when somebody with logic walks in, you can tear down their story immediately. Literally, using their own words. It all falls apart. But this is what he's putting across. He did say that recently he'd noticed Mary was getting heavier, but that contradicts directly what Tatiana's saying. She said in the last month she's lost quite a lot of weight. But he also said that Mary looked gaunter when she was dead than she had ever looked when she was alive. As if that's some kind of evidence. Oh, well, you know, at the end of the day, I did notice when I found her dead that she didn't look as well as when she was alive. I mean, again, this guy is so devoid of empathy, it's truly terrifying. Like I said, when you think about antisocial personality disorder, when you think about these kind of traits within the personality disorder, certainly he seems to be exhibiting some because he's got absolutely no connection with what's real in this situation, which is a beautiful little girl has died. He also goes on to admit that they did leave her for prolonged times to sleep, even though apparently she was never lethargic. And he said that in the time between finding Mary's body and calling the police, because clearly they want to know what on earth were you doing, apparently he and Tatiana sat there and cried. But then he also has to say, well, okay, we did cry. And we did call our lawyers. And yeah, we did do some cleaning. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, you're in a situation where you've literally just been dealt the worst tragedy you could ever envisage or have nightmares about experiencing as a parent, the loss of your beloved baby, and you're having to process the terror, horror, finality, gravity of this incalculably painful moment. And then you're like, where's the surface cleaner? Have we got any bin bags? I just need to do a spring clean. I feel like in this moment right now, this is the perfect opportunity to get my house in order. It's going to be a good distraction. Said no grieving parent ever, but said absolutely a guilty murderer. Always. People who are murderers, who are guilty, familiarly, often clean the crime scene for lots of different reasons. One, they don't want investigators walking in and realising what filthy human beings they are and the danger and risk that the individuals who were living there have been placed at. But they also want to do it because potentially there can be incriminating issues around. So getting rid of that can also be very helpful. So that's what they do. They clean. Detectives aren't having any of it, of course, and so they're constantly pressing him about the malnourishment of his little girl. He's really calm during the interview. He even laughs at multiple points. And I appreciate that some people will say, well, people do laugh when they're nervous. That is true, but that's not the kind of laughter we're talking about. He is completely at ease in a really uncomfortable way. It's almost as if he's packaged this in his head that he's going to go into that interview. He's going to be accepted story-wise. He's going to leave and everyone's going to be like, oh, it's really sad that you lost your little girl, but off you go now. You did nothing wrong. It's ludicrous because to anybody with an iota of intelligence, which is everyone that listens to this channel, you are 100% aware of his guilt immediately. But he seems completely nonplussed by this. It just isn't connecting. Now, after both the interviews have been carried out, Seth and Tatiana get placed in a special room together, and of course they do because it means that they can be watched. And these meetings are really imperative for the detectives because, of course, they can kind of see how they interact. They can see whether one is more of a suspect than the other, or whether it is two people who've operated together, whether they're both aware of one another's guilt, how they interact on a physical level with each other. Are they comfortable? Is one of them scared? It's important to put them in that situation. Now, immediately, Tatiana's theorising about the techniques that the detectives have used. She talks about what she discussed with the police. They literally casually discuss their interviews, and they even mimic the police, which is not a great way to really ingratiate yourself to said police officers. The last thing the interviewers and interrogators want is to see you mimicking them when your child has been found dead, because it just speaks volumes. And then they go on to discuss Mary, and they say that, she looked so bad. Yes, she did. And she'd obviously looked bad for a long time. And the very fact that they're talking about that demonstrates a complete lack of regard for that child and an abandonment fully of their parenting responsibilities. It's hard to believe that both Seth and Tatiana were trying to suggest that they didn't know how malnourished Mary was in the interrogations, because Mary was obviously skin and bones. It's as simple as that. And they knew it. They absolutely knew it. Tatiana had raised 2 children already, and even, wait for it, had a degree in early childhood development. So she was academically aware of how her children should be. So she has literally no excuse for the way that she was acting. Investigators accused both parents of failing to seek medical treatment for Mary, understandably. They've heard from both of the parents that they didn't go and seek the doctor's help. They've heard from both of the parents that they have, shall we say, strange views about how faith can work to heal without any other intervention. And the investigators basically say, look, you both knew that Mary was unwell. There's no way whatsoever that you could not have acknowledged that your daughter was seriously at risk. But what the parents did was basically use the whole sense of, we don't trust the medical system, and we have these very strong religious beliefs, and that's why we refuse to seek medical help. So it is known that some people do genuinely refuse medical treatment. It's why courts in certain countries, including the UK, where I actually live, will at times overrule parental rights. So, for example, if you're a Jehovah's Witness in the UK, and I'm sure around the world, full stop, and you practice that particular belief system, you will not have a blood transfusion. But if you have a child who will die without a blood transfusion, and that child is in hospital, they can overrule your right as a parent, and they can give your child that transfusion. So you do not have a right to remove the opportunity of life from that child because of your religious persuasion. It's different as an adult. You're a lot more allowed to do what you wish, but we're talking about kids. So it's not going to wash that those religious beliefs are an excuse to allow your child to die. And even though they're using their religion, they actually refuse to define their religion, which is a problem. Because the thing about religion is, I don't know, they're quite helpful. They tend to have rule books on the whole. So if the rule books are there, you can go, well, this is why I refuse A, B, or C. But they're not doing that. But I would say that Seth had got quite a lot of his beliefs featured on his Facebook. Where else would you go in the modern day to express your particular connection with divinity? So the Facebook page had lots of different suggestions about his faith and his views. It also revealed that Tatiana was pregnant with their 4th child together. And it also had evidence of Seth's distrust in doctors. He actually said that doctors are priesthoods of the medical cult. And there was a quote, "The righteous shall live by faith. It's God who is sovereign over disease and those sorts of things, and of course, ultimately, deaths." I know you are thinking, how is Seth not a writer? How is he not a wordsmith of the highest level with such a profound quote there? Should we just go through it again? The righteous shall live by faith. It's God who is sovereign over disease and those sort of things, and of course, ultimately deaths. Started off quite well, then just kind of declines, doesn't it, that particular quote? But what is bizarre there is, first of all, we all have different ideas and feelings towards the medical profession. A lot of us, maybe over the COVID pandemic, have had our faith in the medical system a little bit crushed. But most of us, like myself included, if I have a car crash and I'm in serious need of medical attention, the only people I want to see are doctors and nurses. I want them to put me back together because they know what they're doing. And as much as I love people of faith, as much as they're amazing, I don't think it would help me if they were stood around my car praying for me to heal without that medical intervention. I want the blue lights. I want the paramedics. I want them to get me to hospital ASAP, and I want them to do their work because they're good at it, right? So the idea of saying that doctors are priesthoods of the medical cult, it's just nonsensical. You can disagree with certain elements of the medical systems. You can disagree with certain treatments even. You can be somebody who doesn't believe in vaccines and so on and so forth, but it's not a medical cult. It's just people who spent a lot of money getting trained to try to save lives. And also, the idea that God is sovereign over disease, well, we're not talking about disease when it comes down to deaths of the child. We're talking about them starving her to death. It's got little to do with disease and everything to do with an absolute neglectful level of parenting. And hours after the death of Mary, Seth actually wrote on his Facebook page this: "Heart is about shattered, and he was just numb inside." Don't get me wrong, I do think that him writing just numb inside does actually describe him. Just numb, top to toe. If you could describe Seth in one word, what would it be? Numb, on every single level. He also wrote, "Tati and I are the worst parents ever." Now, I don't believe for 1 minute he was writing that as a reality check. I think he's doing that in a very sarcastic manner. Tati and I are the worst parents ever, because he also added, "And I'm really enjoying the loving embrace of an isolation cell from the cops and government employees who keep assuring me they are only here to help." So, again, it's just the arrogance. He's being sarcastic. He's saying, "Oh, you know what? Tati and I are the worst parents ever." Yeah, you know what? Ironically, you are. You think you're being sarcastic, but you're actually stating a fact. You are the worst parents ever. You, on a spectrum of parents, are literally the worst. If there is a literal list with parameters around who is the worst, you're in there. I'm not saying you are the absolute worst, because I have covered a few cases where the torture and the sadism that the parents enjoy whilst killing their child is even bigger than what I'm describing here. But I'm saying they'd fit in that category. They'd be there as worst parents ever. But again, he thinks that this is clever. He thinks that by writing things like that, people will feel sorry for him. And also the authorities will be like, "Oh, hey, maybe we are really treating Seth badly." Like any detective would ever have that conscious thought. But again, you're dealing with a mindset that doesn't function in the way that yours or mine does. Now, the autopsy of Mary's body is awful. It really is. You've got to put yourself in the position that we're talking about a 10-month-old little girl. A baby. A little defenseless, helpless baby. And when they do the autopsy, it's revealed that she hadn't eaten anything for days. I have a 3-month, 3-week-old baby. She feeds on me constantly. I am literally her safety. The proximity to me is really powerfully important to her. When she's hungry, I know immediately, I feel it, and she lets me know, responding to that. And arguably, it's a consistent pattern. And even when she's 10 months, 11 months, 12 months old, she's going to be needing sustenance and nutrition very regularly. The idea of me withholding food or any kind of hydration for days, it's just incomprehensible. It would be agonizing for a baby. And the level of helplessness is just enormous because they have no power. So Mary would have been crying for food. She would have been desperate for attention. She would have been going through the motions of being starved and no one was attending her. Unsurprisingly, when the results came through, they said that the cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration due to neglect by adult caregivers. The report stated that she was so malnourished that her body had started digesting her own muscle mass and her bones were really badly depleted of calcium. So we're talking about a protracted, torturous death. Understandably, her death was ruled as a homicide by the medical examiner. An expert said at the time of 911 being called, Mary had already been dead for at least 72 hours. She'd just been left, just ignored for 3 full days. How can that be? How can adult parents be in a household with a child and not look at them, tend to them, care for them in 3 whole days? At this point, both parents are arrested and ideally thrown into a cell and told that they will only be given bread and water every week once. Because honestly, people like this should have to deal with a taste of their own medicine. If you can inflict this kind of agony on a child, then maybe you should know what it's like to endure it for a period of time. And Tatiana and Seth are charged on the 6th of August 2018 with felony murder and first-degree child abuse in connection with the death of their daughter Mary. At this point, they appear through a video link. It's in the 63rd District Court. Judge Sarah Smolensky, she presented them with the allegations against them. And I would say that both Seth and Tatiana were unbelievably shocked at the charges, and even more shocked when the possible sentences were told to them, which is blindsiding. You killed your kid, you starved her to death. Why are you surprised there's going to be some extreme consequences? Seth shakes his head in disbelief. He opens his mouth so far that I genuinely hope that something fell in and choked him. That's what he looked like, just this aghast at the reality that somehow that superiority and arrogance and confidence he believed would get him everywhere had got him absolutely nowhere.
That is a charge called homicide and felony murder. It is life without parole. It requires a DNA sample to be taken upon arrest.
And Tatiana's in tears. She does show emotion, without a doubt. I think that there is a deep dawning on Tatiana about what a reprehensible human being she'd become. Both Seth and Tatiana were held then without the possibility of bail, and neither of them entered a plea at that point. The case was then sent to Kent County Circuit Court. Now, their responses to that charge have literally gone viral. I'm sure lots of you will have seen it, because you just watch as the safety that they had created in their mind about somehow getting away with this just dissipates. And all of a sudden, they are looking at life behind bars. And it literally does not dawn on them until that second. There is something actually deeply satisfying about it. I'm not a sadistic person. There is something deeply satisfying about it, isn't there? It's particularly him. You look and you're like, yeah. I would like every murderer to have that physical moment, because it doesn't always happen. There's something cerebral, visceral, reality-wise about those moments where suddenly somebody gets hit, and that selfishness and egocentricity that they think's got them so far is their very downfall. And now all the power that they believe they had, just, it's gone immediately. Now, Seth and Tatiana's 2 other children, bear in mind, they are victims. Their mother and father are no longer going to be present. They were only 2 and 4. They get placed in the care of their grandparents. But we do have to acknowledge that they both weren't seriously unwell like their sister was. And I genuinely do hope that their life is better with the grandparents. I don't know whether it will be, because understandably, Seth and Tatiana are products of their environment potentially. But it is harrowing to imagine that those children were living around that situation where their sister was starving to death. I will imagine that that would be deeply traumatizing as they get older, just having the knowledge of that. I hope they're protected to some degree from it. Now, looking back at Seth, around the time of his arrest, he actually told Wood TV that he was unaware that Mary was ill. He actually said that the autopsy was conducted lazily and believes it was something else that caused Mary's death. It's unbelievable, isn't it? We've got the autopsy carried out by people who are figuring out what killed the little girl. The autopsy results come back. You don't even need to do one with respect. If you've got eyes, the investigators saw it the day that they actually saw the little girl's body. She had starved to death. It was obvious, but not for Seth. Seth's like, was it actually malnutrition? It was malnutrition. Are you sure? Absolutely sure. But is it? Because isn't it survival of the fittest? No, it's not the survival of the fittest. It was malnutrition, and you literally sell fruit and vegetables, so you could have fed her. But was it not a swarm of locusts? No, it wasn't a swarm of locusts. Are you absolutely sure? Was it a den of snakes? Because they were around in the biblical times as well. Nope. Did the seas part? I've had enough of you now. Just leave. I'm getting this taser from under the deck. No, that's my fantasy again. I'm going down the fantasy route again, aren't I? Anyway, basically, this is what he's doing. He's blaming the authorities and saying that the autopsy was conducted lazily. So Seth claimed that the reason that they didn't go ahead and seek the medical help was because it was just as dangerous as not going. So let's just think about this in a logical way. Are you saying, Seth, that you not seeking medical help was as dangerous as if you had sought medical help? Got it in one. So you're saying that letting your daughter definitely die by starvation because you weren't protecting her or feeding her, that was just the same level of danger as going and seeing a doctor who would have said, this child is malnourished, we need to feed her. Exactly. That's how dangerous the doctors would have been. But the doctors would have said that she needed feeding. Exactly. And can you trust food? Well, yeah, it's food, but not if it's medically prescribed, because you can't trust the medical cult. Seth, your child needed food. You literally let her starve to death. How is that less dangerous? How is her dying less dangerous than her going to a doctor and being nutritionally fed, put on a drip, hydrated and saved? Now you put it like that, you would think that made sense. But have you thought about the swarm of locusts? That's all I'm saying. Honestly, you have nowhere to go with people like Seth, do you? Nowhere to go. By the way, if you're thinking, why is she talking about locusts? It's just a biblical reference, okay? I forgot. A lot of people won't even know anything about locusts and them being a curse within the Bible. Apologies if people are confused. But basically, this is it. Apparently, it's really bad to seek medical help because they might help you, and that could be really dangerous, as opposed to not getting any help where you just die. He also claimed to be unfairly charged, saying that he was being made an example of for my very strong faith. Honestly, did this guy go to the same mindset school as Ted Bundy? I'm a victim. Ed Kemper as well. I'm a victim. We're all victims. It's not our fault. It's everybody else's fault. If people just understood that the reason my little beautiful gorgeous girl is dead is because I'm a man of faith, people would understand. At the end of the day, God did, for example, suggest that one of his followers should kill his own child to prove his faith. I was just evidencing that. I think you'll find in that story that the child doesn't get killed. I was just going further though and letting it happen. Honestly, it is just diabolical that these individuals walk our planet. But Seth believes that he's just such a strong man of faith that he allowed his child to die an agonizing, excruciating death. Please throw the book at him, and everyone have a go at throwing that book. A really strong, hard-backed, heavy one. Everybody in the court, including the press. Anyway, he denied starving Mary. He said that they'd been feeding her chicken, potatoes, apples, cheese, giving her all the good stuff. He even told a TV station she died. It's a tragedy. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. No, Parents give food, child eats, child lives. There you go. Slightly different quote, but I think you'll find more effective. But he's just throwing it out there that somehow, because this beautiful little girl doesn't know how to nutritionally sustain herself, that somehow it's not his fault and that God made the choice. All those children in hospital being cared for and being healed, apparently God's not involved there. It's just the medical call. When we raise billions of pounds for charities so that hopefully famines in certain countries can end, or when we send aid to things like the tsunami struck land when that happened, we are apparently just part of some bigger cult. We should just let God deal with it and allow all those people to die. It's ludicrous mentality, but it works for Seth. It's how he's packaged up his guilt and made it more palatable for himself. The couple end up having a probable cause hearing. This is in October 2018. And the judge referred to Seth's lack of emotional response in the 911 call regarding Mary's death. And the forensic pathologist who had to do the job of performing the autopsy on Mary, they testified that she was suffering from chronic malnutrition. And it's so upsetting because he said it would have taken weeks for the child to get into such a condition. He said for her muscles to have been wasting away, it would have been so painful, and that she would literally been unable to crawl or even to lift her head. We're talking about a baby. They just decimated this little girl's body. Additionally, investigators started to talk about the condition of the house at the time of Mary's death, and it was grotesque. Seth and Tatiana are hapless, hopeless losers. Sorry. It's not the most psychological terms to use, but I'm absolutely in context when I say it. They were living in a disgraceful condition, disgusting. And we all have situations where we have clutter. Anybody with kids knows that sometimes you look at your house at the end of the day and you think, is it acceptable if I book a 1-week package holiday somewhere else so I can just gather the kids up and leave and just pretend none of this exists? We've all been there. But they didn't get that memo to tidy up at the end of a difficult day like the rest of us did. No, they just allow mess to accrue, and then that mess becomes filth. And that filth becomes dangerous because it's a hazard for children. And apparently in their home, there were mice feces in drawers. The house was full of flies, so you can imagine that the flies are there because there's mouldy food, and they're having life cycles within their home because so much debris is there. Mary's mattress was really filthy. It was described as torn and stained and black. So obviously she's urinated on it. She'll have defecated on it. It's not being cleaned, and it gets that almost sooty appearance when that happens. And they said that the actual mattress itself was literally stained and soaked through with urine. So can you imagine the smell? This little girl was literally living in conditions worse than people in prison in the most underdeveloped countries live. She's a prisoner in her own home in the most distressing of circumstances. And bear in mind as well, she's very underweight, she's very malnourished, having that mess around her, defecation, etc., that's going to put her at a massive risk of infection, and she won't have the power to fight off an infection. So whether the actual lack of nutrition got her or infection got her at the end, it was going to be one of them because her conditions were squalid and disgusting. Now, the couple's defence attorney, they actually said that the medical examiner had in fact jumped to the wrong conclusion. Oh, did you? Did you? Yeah, wrong conclusion. Are you the defence attorney? I am the defence attorney, and I am telling you, as the defence attorney, the medical examiner, who's highly qualified, has got it wrong. So you're saying that the child didn't die of malnutrition, even though the investigators on the first day could see that she had died of malnutrition. I'm saying exactly that. I'm saying they've got it all wrong. My clients did not cause the death of this child. Okay, go on. Let's hear you out. So they argued that they had been looking after Mary, and Tatiana had even been breastfeeding her effectively, and essentially they were doing the best that they could. then Seth's attorney, they said, well, yeah, we agree. And actually, we'll add to that, we think that Mary was suffering from a metabolic disorder and that this had prevented her from absorbing nutrients. So for those of you who don't know what metabolic disorder is, when you have it in infants, the conditions that affect the way the body uses food and the way it converts it into energy. Now, some of these disorders can be really serious, and if they're left untreated, metabolic disorders can affect a baby's health, a baby's development. In some cases, there can actually be life-threatening issues, because in a healthy infant, enzymes in the digestive tract, they break down or metabolize breast milk or formula into sugars, fats, amino acids, and then the body uses these compounds either immediately or stores them so they can be used later. But if a baby has a metabolic disorder, that process doesn't occur as it should. So instead, the body has either too much or too little of a substance, such as amino acids and glucose, and that means that there's a nutritional imbalance, and those nutritional imbalances can lead to health issues, and you can get things like extreme lethargy, fussiness, weakness. You can get breathing issues, poor feeding issues, failure to thrive, obviously, vomiting, poor weight gain, seizures, lack of hair, loss of hair, and some metabolic disorders can be really problematic and can even cause neurological problems, learning disabilities. But for the most part, when a doctor's aware of it, they can actually help manage the condition. It's one of the reasons that if you have a baby in hospital, they'll often take a heel prick, because a heel prick of blood, they can test for these, but they say this is what was going on with Mary, and the medical examiner just hadn't figured it out, even though they'd left it to a point where if it were even the case that there was a metabolic disorder, they would have had plenty of time to manage it if they'd just sought medical attention. And then the defence went on to argue that the couple lacked any medical expertise to diagnose Mary. They said, these two young people are not nutritionists. They're not dietitians. No, they're not. They're not dietitians. They're not nutritionists. They're not doctors or healthcare professionals. But none of that would matter anyway, because only God can make the decision. Only the big God can decide whether you live or die. No one else. The whole medical system hasn't ever existed, and it's just God. If I, when I'm ill, do not first think of going, God, can you please tell me what's going on? And then I'll wait a while, and if I'm still here 3 weeks down the line and I've got a problem, maybe then I'll ask for some help. I don't know what I'm doing. Genuinely, like I said, I have a deep faith. I very much feel God in my life, but I don't think that God has a job of looking after me directly. I think God is there for me when I struggle, and I think God is there to lead me down a path of positive behaviour and action, to be as good as I can possibly be, although I do mess up sometimes. But the point is, I don't think he's my personal life coach, doctor, healer, nutritionist, dietitian, and so on and so forth. The truth is, Seth was the one arguing that they didn't need any of that because they have the big God on their side. So again, the defence doesn't really make any sense. And unsurprisingly at this point, there was a petition made to Children's Protective Services to terminate the parental rights of Seth and Tatiana over the other two children. And of course, that petition was filed because they're never going to be able to look after those kids, are they? They're not safe to, and where they're going, they're not going to have the opportunity to. The prosecution's argument was that Mary hadn't been fed for days, and that in the 10 months that she'd actually been alive, she'd only ever gained a single pound, which is just harrowing. For those of you who have had babies, you'll know we expect to see pretty good level of weight gain in the first early months, and that's why your health visitors will come around. In the UK that happens, and they will weigh them and make sure that they're thriving. We have different percentiles in the UK to make sure that they're following a trajectory that's effective, and obviously that will ensure that you know that your child is gaining the right amount of weight. But they weren't caring about that at all. So if she'd only put on 1 pound that entire time, it would have been obvious from the get-go that there was something seriously amiss. The prosecution also said that the motive for Tatiana and Seth not taking Mary to get help was the fear the CPS would be called on them. I think we can absolutely agree that's the case because it was noted in the interview with Tatiana. But it's not faring well, shall we say, for these individuals when it comes down to the actual trial. Now, Seth's begins in January 2020, and during the trial, the jury is shown what I can only describe as the most disturbing images ever of Mary's corpse. You know, her eyes were wide open. They were sunken right into her face. That's something that's going to stain the jury's conscience forever. The prosecution actually told the jury, this is torture, and they were 100% right. It absolutely is torture. Investigators said that the photos of Mary were literally among the worst images they had ever seen, and these are dyed-in-the-wool investigators. The prosecution spoke of how Mary had no muscle, as her body had begun to digest herself. They said that she was so starved that she was unable to cry or to move her arms, and that is just devastating, because it's all kids have at that age. To let you know through vocalizing their cry that they need you, and to move their arms. They have so little control, but they can do that. And she was stripped of those very few opportunities and options that she had to express herself. And for the investigators, it was clearly very difficult, because they could see that this gorgeous little baby had just been treated almost like an object that could be discarded, that could just be neglected. And they were fathers, they were parents, and to see the absolute mismatch between their feelings towards their children and the feelings they'd seen bestowed by Tatiana and Seth, it must have been absolutely tragic to carry that reality. The prosecution said that Seth let Mary die, as she was basically an inconvenience to him. He felt that she was too small, she was too weak to help on their farm, and that it was natural selection, which is, of course, the term that he used. The jurors were also informed about the fact that Seth spent the 90 minutes between finding Mary's unresponsive body and calling 911, along with apparently contacting his parents, who were the lawyers. So that was where he got his legal advice from, apparently. And then Seth also, during this time period, texted an acquaintance about the sale of a goat. Did I just say that? Did the words the sale of a goat just come out of my mouth? That actually happened. Now, I've done a lot of cases on child neglect. I've done a lot of cases on child death, but never have I done one where basically during the period of finding the body and getting emergency services involved, was there a moment where one of the offenders texted someone that they knew about the sale of a goat. But Seth is extraordinarily diabolical as a human being. Also, during this period of time, where he should be hysterical and broken and coming to terms with the tragic loss of this gorgeous little girl, he also Googled information about the kidnapping of a rapper. This is totally unrelated, it's totally random. It shows an absolute lack of care, a lack of remorse, a lack of concern, a lack of logic with respect as well. But that's what he did. I mean, one can only imagine that when dealing with the horror that is unfolding in front of your eyes when you find your baby, that it seems almost obvious to just think, well, I'm just going to talk to my friend about selling him a goat, see what's happening to 50 Cent who might be kidnapped. I don't know whether it was that person who was being kidnapped. I don't think it was, but you know what I mean. It's ludicrous. So no remorse, no guilt at all. And there was testimony given as well about Seth that said that when Mary was crying, he didn't answer her calls, and actually that he'd get upset by Mary getting upset, that it was something that provoked him. It didn't make him want to soothe her. It just annoyed and aggravated him. The jury was told that Mary had been left on her own for at least 19 and a half hours before Seth actually found her unresponsive body. And also they were told about a peephole in her bedroom door so they could look in on her. She was just left. They didn't even go in the door. How lazy can you be? They had a peephole so they could peer in. They couldn't even be asked to open the door and walk in to see how their baby was, because they didn't care. They didn't have any concern. She was just an inconvenience to their lives, and they treated her that way. Also, during the trial, they brought in a child abuse paediatrician, and that child abuse paediatrician testified that without a shadow of a doubt, Seth had starved his child to death. And it's at this point in this testimony that Seth is seen sobbing. But we all know Seth wasn't sobbing for himself at all. And Thankfully, the jury were completely unconvinced by these tears because they felt that it was just absolutely a distraction technique. It wasn't a genuine emotion. I remember the jury said, we really didn't buy it. He didn't have any tears. None of us saw any tears. Psychopath 101 book. I mean, it is, isn't it? They think that they can look sad, but they forget the main reality of being sad in that way and emotional in that way is that you see tears dropping and dripping down the face. And often people who are crying, they cover their face. We feel a real level of vulnerability when we cry. It makes us feel on show. So often we'll put our head down and we'll cover our eyes. We really don't want people to connect with it. But when you're putting a show on, it's because you're putting a show on. And Seth's doing that, not because he gives a shit, because he can't care less about anything other than his freedom. Of course, his defence attorney comes in and says that, no, this hadn't been deliberate. They didn't deliberately starve Mary to death. It's simply that Seth and Tatiana got out of the depth. Yeah, got out of the depth. Now, just going to throw it out there, I have occasionally got out of my depth. For example, I once bought a set of flat pack furniture and it didn't go well. Realised I got out of my depth. Had to call my dad. Sometimes I'll take on a dinner service, for example, where I invite quite a lot of people around in the family, and I realise that I'm vegetarian. I haven't got a clue how to cook meat. Bit out of my depth, not going to lie. Usually need to refer to a handbook and a recipe to ensure that I don't send anybody to hospital with some horrible food poisoning. Out of my depth. Sometimes, emotionally, I've been a bit out of my depth. I've needed to, call a mate, have a chat. But never have I got to a point where I've been out of my depth that I've thought, whoa, where are my kids? When did I last feed them? Oh, maybe I just need to ask God. Maybe he'll know. That doesn't happen in any universe. Getting out of your depth isn't an excuse for starving your child to death. So Seth's attorney said that, this was all down to his disbelief in doctors due to this strong religious faith and how he prayed in hopes of making Mary better. So, again, just going to throw it out there, it's not a good defence, saying it's all Seth's mindset, which is corrupted and bizarre, that has led to the death of his child. That equally makes him culpable. He also said, as his defence, that ineptitude and mistaken religious beliefs do not equal child abuse. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So, let me just put it out there to Seth's defence team. Safeguarding of children is not an option based on your religious belief system. It just isn't. You can't say, well, in the Bible, which I follow, it says I can do A, B, and C. There is a law. There is legal culpability. It doesn't matter how useless you are as a human being. If you have religious beliefs and those religious beliefs cause the death of a child, you're not exempt. You don't get a free pass. And it's a ludicrous defence, but I guess they had nowhere else to go with it. The attorney also acknowledged that their fear in getting medical help was about social services looking into the family. Well, that is the truth. I absolutely agree with that. I don't doubt that for 1 minute. It's down to selfish beliefs about what social services would think if they saw the state of the home and the state of their kids. So that's what they wanted to avoid. They wanted to avoid services getting involved, and they knew they would. So that makes them even more culpable. That they absolutely were aware of why they weren't getting help and why they weren't seeking help, because they wanted to be left alone, even if that cost the life of one of their kids. So it took 3 days of testimony, and after those 3 days of testimony, the jurors took just 80 minutes to decide the verdict of Seth Welch. And you won't be surprised to hear that the jury was unanimously convinced of Seth's guilt. And in an interview with one of the jurors after the trial, they said that they were really troubled, as given Mary's condition, it must have been apparent for weeks or months, which meant that there was literally lots of opportunities to intervene, but neither of them did. And it's not just them, because that would suggest that Seth and Tatiana saw nobody during that period of time. I mean, who else failed that kid? Who else failed that beautiful baby? Without a doubt. They would have had contact with other people. So who else was looking into that life and doing nothing about it? Missed opportunities, failed social connections who should know better and do better as far as I'm concerned. On the 27th of January 2020, Seth Welch was convicted of felony murder and first-degree child abuse. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as this is the mandatory penalty for felony murder in Michigan, which is, without a shadow of a doubt, the right decision and the right justice, because that gorgeous little girl deserved for him to pay, and for him to pay at a level where he understands the consequences of his actions, because I genuinely don't think all the way through this that he did. Now, Tatiana, she initially pleaded no contest to charges of second-degree murder and second-degree child abuse. I'll be honest with you, she should have gone with that, but the court allowed her to withdraw this plea in May 2020, as she was going to use the defence of duress and have the jury decide her fate. I think that was a really bad call. I genuinely do. Just the case I've talked to you about today, I think you will all already be absolutely confirmed of her guilt. But nonetheless, this is what they decided to do. Now, there was a delay in the trial of Tatiana because of COVID-19. And then during her trial, which happened in October 2021, Tatiana testified that she was abused and apparently tortured by her husband, Seth, for years. She said that he would verbally, physically, sexually assault her. She described Seth as a control freak. She even recorded an instance where Seth held a gun to her head and raped her. She also said that Seth had attempted to perform an exorcism on her when she was pregnant with their fourth child. Apparently he was reading verses from the Bible, and he was taking his open palm and smacking her in between the shoulder blades over and over, and he was just saying things like, "Demon, be gone." Apparently this was something that had featured in their relationship. Her attorney said that this abuse left her a shell of the person she was before being with Seth. And they said that this is the abuse that meant that Tatiana was unable to care for Mary and was afraid to protect her. Her attorney said that she was prevented from caring for her child the way that she wanted to. She said that Seth would prevent her from going into Mary's bedroom to check on her. And she maintained her claim that she fed and nursed Mary. She also maintained that she breastfed Mary daily. She also said that she would leave pureed fruit and vegetables for Seth to feed Mary while she wasn't at work. So she's indicating that it was all his fault, none of her fault, and that she was just a victim. It's as simple as that. I'm sorry, I don't buy that. I just cannot buy into it. Look, I don't know whether there was abuse. It's quite possible that somebody with a personality like Seth would be abusive to her. But there were no indicators in that video conversation after they'd both been interviewed by the police that there was anything but, I would say, tenderness between the two of them. But what goes on behind closed doors certainly can play out in the most violent and sadistic of fashions. Arguably, though, she was allowed to go to work, so she wasn't completely without a support system around her. And if the other children were fed, why would it be that this particular child was ignored by Seth if it were not also a case that she were intentionally ignoring the child as well? And the very fact that she had access to the outside world being at work means that she could at any point have asked for support from a colleague and said, "My child is starving to death at the hands of my abusive partner. Please help me save my child." She didn't. So if she was abused in the way that she's talked about, I feel incredibly sorry for her. No partner should ever be violently and sadistically harmed in such a horrific context. Of course not. Goes without saying. But you've got a mouth, you've got opportunities, call the police, call the emergency services, get your child the help and support it deserves. But she didn't. So I'm not willing to accept any of these excuses. She had the power to go to work. She had the ability to no doubt deal with customers, and she did it in a way that must have sustained her to some degree because she wasn't being sacked. So it meant that she could build relationships and alliances, and therefore she had the chance to call emergency services. The fact that she didn't means that she violated her role as a parent. And I have every bit of empathy with women and men who are in horribly coercive and violent relationships. But I'm sorry, if you choose not to do anything to protect your child at that point, you are still complicit in the abuse, and in this case, the death of a baby girl. Now, during the trial, the jury has shown the most awful crime scene photographs. Mary's emaciated condition. They also played that 911 call made by Seth. And Tatiana, during her trial, I would say, is more emotional, as we would expect her to be, because she has, with respect, been more emotional all the way through. But I do have to say, a little bit like where Seth is concerned, I kind of feel like it's a dawning realization on her part throughout, from that initial interrogation and interview where she's still kind of giggling with the police, not taking it that seriously, and talking to them about how she'd just been trying to deny that there was something wrong with the child and seeming to play this really nurturing role, to suddenly recognizing that hasn't worked, and now she's in the line of fire. And at this point, she's starting to get very emotional. But again, I stand by the reality that it's for herself. On the 15th of October 2021, Tatiana's found guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. She's then sentenced in front of Kent County Judge Paul J. Denfield. Before her sentencing, the judge said this: "This is a tragic case from where I'm sitting. I'm not sure that I'll ever understand what these parents were doing or thinking to, I guess I would have to say, literally watch their child starve to death." And they're right. That's exactly what they did. For Mary's murder, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was also sentenced to the child abuse charge of 15 to 30 years, which will run concurrently with the life sentence. She'll also be ordered to pay fines and court costs. Tatiana didn't speak in court. Now, following the sentencing, Tatiana's attorney said that there would actually be an appeal to her case as soon as possible. And the reason that she appealed was on the grounds that there was insufficient evidence to maintain conviction of child abuse. The court disagreed. She also argued that the court made a mistake by not instructing the jury on duress. Now, while duress is not a justification for committing a crime, it can serve as an excuse when a defendant committed a crime because they were facing the threat of physical force, for example. The defence has to establish that a reasonable person in the defendant's position would also have therefore committed the crime, and the court disagreed, because all she needed to do was to tell a friend at work, or call somebody, or just walk out of the house with the child. At the end of the day, that is how easy it would have been. She wasn't imprisoned. She wasn't in a situation where she was under such duress that her life was at risk, or the life of her children was at risk, aside from the fact that she purposefully and willfully allowed one of her children to be at risk because of the neglect. She had ample opportunities to actually ask for some kind of intervention, and she just didn't. So the court fully disagreed with that, and the appeal was dismissed on the 23rd of March 2023, which is ironically my birthday, which is quite a present for me, really, because believe me, it is a gift seeing these two individuals sent down for life. They deserve it. When it comes down to the personality traits, I appreciate it's far easier to see Seth as the main antagonist, because he is arrogant, egotistical, probably quite narcissistic, likely psychopathic, and therefore it's easy to jump to the conclusion that he is the main instigator, particularly with his delusional belief system. But she was the mother. And I'm not going to say that she's more culpable. She isn't. It's not fair that women are always judged more harshly when these kind of failures occur. But she is equally responsible. And she abandoned what it is to be a mother. And she abandoned that little baby girl, and she left her to starve to death alone, helpless, scared, hungry, desperate, in that cot, in that prison, in that cell of a place, because that's what that hellhole was. And she did it knowingly. So they are equally responsible for this crime. And I hope they equally struggle every second of every day with what their actions led to. Because even if they can't feel the sympathy and empathy that they should have for the child that they lost, I think they're selfish enough to feel sympathy and empathy towards themselves. And therefore, they will regret their actions purely on the basis that they are no longer free. And I'm not sure which God Seth thought he was praying to, but I'm pretty sure the pearly gates ain't going to be where either of them are going. I'd love to know your thoughts on this case. It's horrible. It's really horrible. Because we talk about the content, because we have to, and we discuss the victim because it's important, but then when we bring it back into sharp focus and we think about what we're actually discussing, we're discussing the torturous death of this beautiful baby girl who starved away in front of her parents' neglectful eyes, who could have been saved at any point, and was just left to wither because of this delusional belief in the survival of the fittest and that God was the one with all the action and the answers. It's harrowing. This video is absolutely dedicated to Mary Ann Welch, and wherever she is, let's hope that she is freer and surrounded in the bliss of love for all eternity, something that her useless, pathetic, horrible humans who were her parents will ever have the opportunity to experience. Take care, guys. Let me know your thoughts on this case. Be safe. And this is dedicated to Mary. Fly high, sweetheart.